Hello, ahead of you is a brief summary of the film Django Unchained. Enjoy watching. Somewhere in Texas, 2 years before the Civil War, a pair of armed riders are driving a line of dark-skinned workers performing forced labor, passing through the picturesque landscapes of the Wild West. Suddenly at night, a mysterious carriage approaches them. The driver, upon the riders' demand, introduced himself as Dr. Schultz, a dentist, as evidenced by the huge tooth on the roof of his carriage. The doctor said he was looking for them, traveling after the fair. He needed one of the workers they had acquired from a specific plantation. It turned out to be Django. When Schultz asked if he knew the Brittle brothers and could recognize them, Django answered affirmatively. The overseers didn't like that the doctor was politely conversing with the worker and, saying there would be no deal, told him to get lost, threatening him with weapons. Realizing the conversation had reached an impasse, Schultz swiftly drew his revolver and neutralized the first rider, then stopped the second by shooting his horse. The dentist declared he was taking Django, then freed him and told him to take the clothes of one of the overseers while he handled the transactions. To the bewildered remaining workers, he offered a choice: help their master get to town or bury him and head to the more tolerant north. It's not hard to guess what they chose. Meanwhile, Schultz and Django arrive in a town whose residents are astonished at the sight of a dark-skinned man on horseback. They head to a saloon whose owner, outraged by Django's presence in his establishment, rushes to fetch the sheriff. Over a glass of beer, the doctor explains that he no longer practices medicine but is a bounty hunter and explains the whole process. He offers Django a deal to help him find the Brittle brothers, whose appearance, unlike Django, he does not know. And in return, he promises freedom and $25 for each of the brothers. The sheriff arrives and demands explanations from the dentist about what's happening, but instead receives a shot. Schultz tells the saloon owner that now he can call the marshal. The federal marshal, positioning his men with guns aimed at the saloon, orders the dentist to come out with his hands up. Schultz, ensuring he won't be harmed, along with Django, complies, and once outside, explains that the sheriff he neutralized was actually a criminal with a bounty on his head. To confirm his words, he shows the warrant issued to him by the district judge. During a rest stop, when the doctor asks what he plans to do when he gets money and freedom, Django replies that he will find and buy his wife. Her first owners were Germans, so they named her Broomhilda. The mistress taught Hildy her native language. Arriving in Tennessee, they head to a clothing store where Schultz outlines a plan in which Django will play the role of a valet when they arrive at the plantation. The dressed-up worker and the dentist arrive at the planter's estate. The doctor states that he intends to purchase one of the workers and convinces the estate owner to go into the house to discuss business. Meanwhile, one of the girls shows Django the plantation. Stepping aside a bit, he asks if she knows 3 overseers who arrived last year. She points to one in the field. Django immediately recognizes him. He once tormented Broomhilda. The other 2 near the stable were about to punish a girl. Boiling with anger, he approaches them and, arriving before they begin their actions, calls out to one of the brothers and shoots him. Then he grabs a whip and starts beating the second with it. To the general astonishment of the workers, he finishes the job with the help of a revolver. At that moment, Schultz arrives and, following Django's directions, stops the third brother, who was galloping across the field. Explaining to the angry planter what happened and showing him the warrant for the eliminated criminals, the bounty hunters quickly leave. At night, the dentist placed dynamite into the hole in the large tooth on his carriage instead of money and left it in the middle of the field. He anticipated that the vengeful plantation owner would try to retaliate and prepared a trap, into which those attempting an attack fell. The explosion startled everyone nearby, while Django neutralized the leader of the attackers. During a break, the doctor shared the story of Broomhilda from the German epic and, concerned about letting the freed worker go to the fair alone in search of his wife, proposed a deal: to work together as bounty hunters until the end of winter, save up money, and then, better prepared, set out to find Hildy. During their first assignment, while lying in ambush, Django hesitated, unable to shoot a man peacefully working in the field with his son. Schultz then taught him a lesson. He pulled out a wanted poster for the man, who was accused of robberies and attacks. The doctor said that if Django wanted to save his wife by doing this job, he needed to eliminate the criminal. After that, Django, without hesitation, pulled the trigger. Later, after honing his shooting skills on a snowman, they captured an entire gang and delivered evidence to the local sheriff. Having earned enough money, they headed to Mississippi for the fair to search for Broomhilda's trail. In a ledger, they found a record stating that she now belonged to Calvin Candy, the owner of the Candyland plantation, infamous among workers. Schultz explained that she wouldn't simply be sold, but could be given as a bonus with a more valuable Mandingo fighter if they offered a substantial amount. The doctor would pose as a wealthy buyer, and Django would act as a trader of workers. They arrived at the club. At the entrance, they were met by Mr. Candy's attorney, who escorted them to the second floor. Without taking his eyes off a match between fighters, Candy asked Schultz why he wanted a Mandingo, and after hearing the answer, out of boredom, invited him to sit down. Django and the attorney stepped aside to the bar, where Django remarked about a man wearing a hat indoors. Then he sat with his back to everyone and lit a cigarette while the others watched the match. Candy was particularly thrilled as his fighter won and defeated the opponent. The scene caused fear and sadness among those present. On Candy's order, his fighter ended the match with a hammer. When they moved on to discuss the deal, Django boldly stated that they intended to buy not just any fighter, but the very best. Candy initially refused but became interested when he heard the offer of $12,000. During a brief stop on the way to Candyland, Candy's men mocked Django, who in response threw one of them off a horse and then warned against further attacks by pulling out his revolver. Mr. Candy called for calm, reminding everyone that guests must remain safe. On the way, Django demonstrated his authority by humiliating other workers, much to Schultz's dismay. The doctor asked him not to get carried away and risk their plan, but Django assured him he was just playing his role. On the plantation grounds, the group encountered Candy's men, who had captured a runaway named D'Artagnan, who had refused to fight anymore. Candy mocked him, mentioning the price he was purchased for. Schultz offered to pay to end the situation, but Django stopped him, stating that they wouldn't pay for someone who no longer held any value. Candy then ordered his men to release the dogs, which horrified those present. Despite the tense situation, Django remained composed and suggested they continue their journey. At the plantation, they were met by Candy's manager, Stephen, who questioned why Django was riding a horse. Candy introduced them to each other and ordered rooms to be prepared for the guests in the big house. Soon after, the doctor requested that Hildy, who spoke German, be brought to him the night before the Mandingo fighters were presented. Candy ordered her to be taken out of the iron box where she had been placed as punishment for trying to escape and to be cleaned up. Django barely held back his anger and compassion as he watched the exhausted Hildy being wheeled away on a cart. In the evening, Candy's sister brought the girl to the doctor. Schultz began speaking to her in German to avoid being overheard. He told her that he had come with a friend to save her and introduced Django. During dinner, they discussed the three best fighters they had seen. Candy was reluctant to give up the best one, while Schultz negotiated. Stephen noticed that Broomhilda and Django were glancing at each other. Catching her in the kitchen, he asked if she knew Django. When she denied it, the cunning old man said he believed her. Meanwhile, the doctor negotiated the purchase of a fighter named Eskimo Joe, saying he would return in 5 days with his attorney to finalize the documents. Candy asked about Schultz's time with Hildy, and Stephen suggested showing the doctor the scars on her back, which he likely hadn't seen and might find fascinating. This demonstration, stopped by Candy's sister, made Django visibly nervous, which did not escape Stephen's notice. He confronted Hildy in the kitchen, exposing her lie. Hearing that Schultz was offering to buy her, Stephen interrupted and called Candy. In the library, Stephen shared his suspicions that Django and Hildy were husband and wife, and that the entire charade was staged because of her. He noted that her actual value was insignificant, but the $12,000 offer had clouded Candy's judgment. Realizing he had been deceived, Candy flew into a rage. He returned to the dining room with a case, from which he pulled out the skull of a long-serving worker from his plantation. He sawed it open and began ranting about what he believed was the innate loyalty of workers, supposedly reflected in the structure of their skulls. At that moment, Butch entered with a shotgun and ordered the guests to put their hands on the table. Candy ordered Broomhilda to be brought in and reminded Schultz that he had been willing to pay $12,000 for the right worker. He asserted that if the deal did not go through, he could do whatever he pleased with her. Schultz interrupted his threats, pulled out the money, and agreed to finalize the deal. The attorney prepared the documents, including the papers for Hildy's emancipation. After signing, Schultz declared he never wanted to see Candy again. However, the plantation owner insisted on a handshake, claiming the deal was incomplete without it. Schultz, irritated by Candy's smugness, used a concealed revolver and eliminated him. Chaos erupted and a shootout began. Django neutralized Butch, the attorney, the guards, and another dozen of Candy's men. Stephen demanded that the shooting stop and offered Django a deal: surrender in exchange for Hildy's life. Django agreed. He was hung upside down in a barn. However, instead of execution, Stephen ordered him to be sent to hard labor, claiming it would be the most grueling punishment imaginable. During transportation, Django persuaded one of the guards to make a deal. He offered part of the bounty for supposedly wanted criminals still at Candyland. Django backed up his words with a document from his work with Schultz, convincing the guards they freed him, but Django quickly eliminated them and returned to the estate. Django first dealt with the mercenaries in the cabin, then retrieved his belongings and Schultz's papers. After bidding farewell to his friend, he set out to rescue Hildy. When the residents of Candyland returned from the funeral, Django was already waiting for them. He eliminated the armed men, freed all the workers except Stephen, and set the house ablaze with pre-planted dynamite. Together with Hildy, he watched the destruction of the estate before riding away as a true victor.